My boss tried to slash my severance and replace me with her friends. So, I took her to court and exposed her web of nepotism. I had been working at Halford and Company for 5 years, long enough to know every creak in the office floorboards, every quirk of the old printers, and every unwritten rule that kept our department running smoothly. We specialized in corporate logistics, a business where precision and trust mattered more than anything. I took pride in my work. I wasn't just clocking in for a paycheck. I felt like I was part of something solid, something that would last. Then she arrived, Claire Donovan, my new department head. She walked in with a sharp suit, sharper smile, and a resume full of buzzwords but no real substance. On her first day, she gathered us in the conference room and told us things were going to change. Efficiency, she said, is about bringing in the right people. I didn't know then just how wrong her definition of right people would be. Within 2 weeks, half of our team was gone, fired, pushed out, or restructured into oblivion. Their placements? Her friends from previous jobs, people with barely a clue about logistics, but plenty of stories about their wild nights out with Claire. It was obvious she was building her own little empire inside the company, and the rest of us were just obstacles in her way. I kept my head down, worked harder, tried to make myself too valuable to lose. But the truth was, I could feel her eyes on me, measuring, waiting. Every day, I walked into the office with a knot in my stomach, wondering if this would be the day she called me into her office with that saccharine smile. When it finally happened, I thought I was ready. I wasn't. She told me my position was being eliminated, and that I'd be given a severance package. But something in her tone felt off. The papers she slid across the desk were worded strangely, and the numbers didn't add up. It hit me then. She was trying to fire me in a way that would cut my payout in half. I left her office with my hands shaking. Fear was my first reaction. But deep down, beneath the fear, something else began to take root. I sat in my car for almost an hour after that meeting, staring at the severance papers in my lap. The numbers weren't just wrong, they were insulting. 5 years of loyalty, late nights, weekends sacrificed, and she wanted to throw me out with barely enough to cover a couple months' rent. I could almost hear her voice in my head, smug and self-assured, thinking I'd be too desperate or too scared to fight back. For a few hours, fear still had me. The thought of losing my job made my chest tighten. Bills, mortgage payments, the savings I'd been building. Everything flashed before me like a warning sign. I thought about signing the papers just to avoid a messy fight, telling myself I could find another job. But deep down, the idea of walking away like that burned. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying her smirk, the way she avoided my eyes when I questioned the payout. She knew what she was doing. She'd probably done it before. By morning, the fear had turned into something colder, sharper, a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I made a pot of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and began researching labor laws. The more I read, the clearer it became. She was breaking the rules, and I had proof. At 10 a.m., I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, a friend of a friend who specialized in employment disputes. We met that afternoon. I laid out everything. The sudden department restructuring, the new hires who were clearly unqualified, the suspicious severance offer. He listened carefully, his expression unreadable, then leaned back in his chair. "She's not just bending the law," he said finally. "She's snapping it in half. And if you're willing to fight, we can make her regret it." Something in me clicked. The fear was gone. In its place was a plan. I wasn't just going to keep my severance. I was going to make sure she never pulled this on anyone again. The next week was a blur of meetings with my lawyer, gathering emails, contracts, and performance reviews. Every document told the same story. I had been a reliable, productive employee. There was no legitimate reason to fire me, and certainly not in a way that slashed my severance. The more evidence we collected, the more confident my lawyer became. "She made a big mistake," he said one afternoon as he sorted through a stack of printed emails. "She left a paper trail, and she had. Every decision, every cutthroat move to bring in her unqualified friends. It was all in writing. There were emails about reshaping the culture and removing old influences that didn't align with her vision. It was corporate poison dressed up as management strategy. I kept my head low at work, pretending to go along with the process while quietly feeding my lawyer everything he needed. Claire avoided me, for the most part, maybe thinking I'd already given up. That suited me fine. Let her think she'd won. But inside, I was running on adrenaline. The fear of losing my job was still there, but it had transformed into fuel. Every sleepless night, every tense morning walking past her office, made my resolve stronger. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone she'd stepped on since the day she arrived. Finally, the day came when my lawyer filed the lawsuit. The complaint was brutal: wrongful termination, breach of contract, and even a claim for damages due to the deliberate attempt to undercut my severance. It named both Claire and the company. When the papers were served, I was at my desk. I didn't see her reaction, but I heard the sharp slam of her office door minutes later. The office went quiet. People glanced at me, their eyes wide, and I just kept typing, a small smile tugging at my lips. The courtroom was sterile and intimidating, bright lights, polished wood, and rows of seats filled with unfamiliar faces. I sat beside my lawyer, heart pounding, palms clammy against the polished surface of the table. Claire sat across the aisle, her posture rigid, lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, I realized how small I'd felt when she first walked into our department. Powerless, unheard, at the mercy of her whims. Opening statements set the tone. My lawyer laid out the timeline, the documents, the lies Claire told. He painted a picture of a department turned upside down by nepotism and deceit. Then it was Claire's turn. Her attorney called it strategic reorganization, a necessary evil for corporate health. I watched her lips move, but all I heard was the thud of my own heartbeat, the crescendo of my resolve. As the trial progressed, evidence brought our office drama into stark relief. A former colleague gave testimony via video, her voice trembling as she described the unfairness of being laid off despite years of top performance. Another email chain showed Claire mocking experienced staffers as dinosaurs who needed to make way for true innovators. Every word she'd typed became a nail in her coffin. Throughout it all, I felt a curious calm wash over me. In that courtroom, I wasn't the anxious employee fearing the loss of everything I'd built. I was someone reclaiming her dignity, demanding accountability. With each piece of evidence, I felt my confidence solidify. On the third day, the judge paused to review the severance clause Claire tried to twist. He frowned, turning to Claire's lawyer. "This language is ambiguous at best and deceptive at worst," he said. A ripple of tension passed through the courtroom. Claire's composure flickered, if only briefly. At the end of the day, as we left the courthouse, my lawyer placed a hand on my shoulder. "Tomorrow we present damages," he said quietly. I nodded, realizing I was no longer battling just for money. I was fighting so no one else would be treated like a disposable asset. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter. The storm that had raged since Claire's arrival was finally meeting the force it deserved, and I was ready for the next round. The morning after our third court session, I woke before dawn, nerves already thrumming through my veins. I reviewed my notes over and over in the soft glow of my desk lamp, convinced that every detail mattered. I kept thinking of Claire's smug expression on the stand, how she leaned back, arms folded, as though daring us to prove her wrong. But we did have proof: pay slips, performance metrics, internal memos, all painting a picture of intentional wrongdoing. Back in the courtroom, the air felt electric. My lawyer began calling depositions. Coworkers who had once been too afraid to speak up. One by one, they recounted Claire's unprofessional behavior, how she belittled seasoned staff, replaced qualified analysts with friends who didn't know a shipment schedule from a dining reservation, and pushed through layoffs with no fair process. I stared at their faces, saw the relief in their eyes as each testified. They weren't just helping me, they were reclaiming their own dignity. When it was my turn, I swallowed hard as I approached the stand. Heart hammering, I looked at the judge and then at Claire, seated just yards away. I spoke slowly, choosing each word deliberately. The pride I felt in my work, the shock when I learned of my termination, the betrayal of finding out about her lies only after the fact. I described the sleepless nights, the uncertainty that clawed at me every time a new restructuring email arrived. For the first time, all those private struggles were laid bare in public, and it felt like both liberation and vulnerability at once. As I sat down, the courtroom seemed to exhale around me. I was no longer hiding behind spreadsheets and silent endurance. I had a voice, and I used it. Claire's face was unreadable, but I sensed her confidence slipping, just a little. We wrapped up that day with closing arguments looming. My lawyer's final words echoed in my mind. This is not just about one employee. The integrity of every worker in this company is at stake. As I stepped out into the crisp air, I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was standing up for everyone who ever felt powerless beneath a manager's whims. And that thought gave me strength I'd never known I had. The morning of the verdict felt surreal. I arrived at the courthouse with my heart thudding against my ribs as though it wanted to break free. Outside, a light drizzle blurred the world, mirroring my swirling emotions. I clutched my coat collar against the chill and stepped inside, determined to face whatever came next. The courtroom was hushed, galleries half filled with curious onlookers and former colleagues whose lives had been upended by Claire's efficiency initiatives. I spotted a few familiar faces, people who had quietly nodded to me in solidarity since the trial began. Their presence steadied me. Claire entered with her trademark poise, but her eyes darted around uneasily. She sat down, and the judge took his seat, papers in hand. Everything felt magnified. The creak of the gavel, the rustle of papers, the soft murmur of lawyers consulting notes. When the judge spoke, his voice carried weight. He recapped the evidence, The lack of legitimate cause for termination, the deceptive severance language, the nepotistic hirings, all laid out like a blueprint of malpractice. My throat tightened as he declared that my dismissal had been wrongful and that I was entitled to full severance plus damages for emotional distress and lost opportunity. Relief and disbelief washed over me in equal measure. I could feel tears pricking the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back. My lawyer allowed himself a small smile. I offered mine back, shaky but genuine. Furthermore, the judge continued, the company must review its management practices to prevent such abuses in the future. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. This was bigger than my case. It was a call for accountability. As the gavel fell, I felt a weight lift off my chest. For the first time in months, I could breathe deeply without that tight knot of dread. The victory was more than financial restitution. It was justice served. Walking out afterward, I noticed Claire lingering at her attorney's side, her face drained of color. I didn't gloat. Instead, I held my head high, knowing I had reclaimed more than my job. I'd reclaimed my dignity and set a precedent no one in Halford and Company could ignore. When I walked back into the office for the first time after the verdict, it felt like stepping into a new world. The usual hum of keyboards and hushed conversations carried a different tone, one of cautious optimism rather than tense avoidance. I paused in the doorway, watching as my colleagues exchanged smiles and discreet thumbs up. Their eyes reflected relief and something I hadn't expected, genuine pride. HR had posted a notice that, effective immediately, all restructuring initiatives were on hold pending a full review of management practices. Claire's old office door sat slightly ajar, her nameplate removed. Rumor mill said she'd been put on paid leave while the company investigated her actions. I didn't gloat. I simply felt the justice of it. 5 years of effort and integrity had been vindicated. My desk was clear to the desk items HR had boxed, and waiting on top was a letter from the CEO. He congratulated me on my courage and dedication, praised my contributions over the years, and formally reinstated me to my former position, along with a full back pay settlement plus the damages awarded by the court. He closed by assuring me the company would take steps to ensure no one else would face the kind of mistreatment I endured. As I unpacked my things, coworkers stopped by to share their own stories of how Claire's so-called efficiency measures had hurt them, and to thank me for standing up. I realized then that this victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who'd been sidelined, who'd lost confidence in the system that once protected them. By midday, HR called me into a brief meeting. New interim leadership was in place, and they wanted my input on rebuilding the department's culture. I felt a rush of purpose. This was my chance to help shape an environment founded on respect and transparency, exactly the opposite of what I'd endured. Walking back to my desk, I breathed deeply. The storm had passed, and in its wake stood not just a man who'd won his case, but a team poised for true renewal. Returning to my desk, that Monday felt surreal. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows as if celebrating my victory, and yet I felt strangely cautious, like a soldier coming home to a changed battlefield. HR had already cleared out Claire's personal items and pint-sized motivational posters, replacing them with a quiet buzz of optimism. My reinstatement letter sat framed on my desk, alongside the CEO's note assuring me that Halford and Company would learn from my case. Over the next few days, I met with the inner management team. They wanted my input on restructuring the department, really rebuilding it this time. We talked about transparent promotion policies, anonymous feedback channels, and training programs to ensure that only qualified candidates filled key roles. I suggested a mentoring program pairing seasoned employees with newer hires to mend the rift Claire's favoritism had created. Watching them nod and take notes, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't known since my first day at the company. My colleagues began to trickle back. Some were rehired, others offered new positions. At first, the hallways were awkward. Polite smiles exchanged with people who had once glared at me in fear. But gradually, laughter returned to lunch breaks, and collaborative energy filled our team meetings. I found myself mentoring a junior analyst who reminded me of the enthusiasm I'd once had, eager, wide-eyed, ready to tackle any challenge. Yet beneath the positive changes, a part of me remained vigilant. I knew it only took one bad actor to undermine these efforts. That's why, alongside my regular duties, I volunteered to serve on the new Ethics Committee, an internal watchdog group tasked with ensuring fair treatment for every employee. Seeing the committee's first report, which called out procedural gaps and recommended swift action, I felt proud that our ordeal could help protect others. In quiet moments, I reflected on how Claire's arrival had felt like an earthquake, shaking the very foundations of my career. Rebuilding these foundations wasn't easy, but with every policy updated and every trust repaired, I reclaimed more of myself. The office felt like home again. My last morning as just another employee began like any other, yet everything felt profoundly different. I stepped into the office lobby and was met with genuine smiles and warm greetings from colleagues who, not long ago, had averted their eyes in fear. The security guard, who once barely nodded at me, offered a cheerful good morning, and I felt the weight of tension from the past months lift with each step toward my desk. The corridors buzzed with renewed energy. Team members I had mentored during the recovery phase now approached me enthusiastically, sharing progress updates on projects they'd once been excluded from. The junior analyst who reminded me of my own early days waved me over to show off a presentation she'd prepared, an initiative I had encouraged to foster collaboration. Seeing her confidence blossom filled me with pride. When I reached my desk, I noticed that HR had already replaced the old nameplate on my office door with a polished new plaque, which read Senior Logistics Analyst. Beneath it, a small crystal award, engraved with integrity in action, caught the morning light. I paused, fingertips brushing the cool surface, and recalled the toll of sleepless nights spent gathering evidence. The knot in my stomach each time I walked past Claire's closed office, and the visceral relief when justice was served. I poured myself a cup of coffee and settled into my chair, now restored to its rightful place amid fresh flowers and a desktop frame holding the judge's commendation letter. From my window, I watched the sun rise over the city skyline, its golden rays illuminating the renovated courtyard below, where a new bench and planter stood as quiet symbols of the company's rebirth. In that moment, I reflected on my journey. 5 years ago, I'd walked through these doors full of ambition, but unaware of the fragility of trust. Back then, I never imagined I'd have to defend my livelihood in court. Yet the battle had forged in me a strength and clarity I wouldn't trade for any promotion. I opened my journal and wrote, "I came here to build a career. Today, I leave with dignity reclaimed, respect earned, and a renewed sense of purpose." I signed it with a steady hand, heart swelling with both nostalgia and anticipation. The chapter of conflict had closed, and a new one, brimming with possibility, lay ahead. Update 1. The morning the verdict was announced felt like the first breath of spring after a long, bitter winter. I arrived at the office more buoyant than I had in years, my steps light, my chest unburdened. Colleagues greeted me with congratulatory smiles, some even applauding as I crossed the threshold into our department. I realized then how small gestures of solidarity had carried me through the darkest days. Sitting at my restored desk, I finally allowed myself to savor the moment. I opened the envelope containing the settlement check. More money than I'd dared hope for, enough to cover my mortgage, pad my savings, and still travel for the first time in ages. The number was almost surreal, proof that standing up for justice could bring real, tangible rewards. But the greatest victory wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that Claire Donovan's reign of favoritism and fear had crumbled. By midday, whispers confirmed that Halford and Company's leadership had taken swift action. Not only was Claire placed on indefinite suspension, but the CEO had personally overseen a full department audit. Morale soared as employees across every section of the firm realized that no manager, no matter how charismatic or connected, was above accountability. Late afternoon brought the final confirmation, an internal memo announcing Claire's termination. The company's owner, in a rare move, added a personal note. He would ensure that her reputation for mismanagement and unfair practices would follow her wherever she went, effectively blacklisting her within the industry. It was a satisfying coda to the ordeal, knowing that her actions would have consequences far beyond our office walls. That evening, as I shut down my computer, I felt a surge of freedom I had never before experienced. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest these past months was gone, replaced by a steady warmth of triumph and relief. I stepped outside into the cool air, inhaled deeply, and smiled. The road ahead was wide open, unencumbered by fear or doubt. And as our company began the painstaking work of rebuilding trust and transparency, I knew I had played a pivotal role in sparking that change. In claiming my own dignity, I had reshaped the destiny of an entire organization, and that, more than any paycheck, was the true reward. In the days following my victory, whispers of Claire's damage spread beyond our department. Clients who once praised Halford and Company as punctual deliveries began to report mistakes, missed deadlines, misrouted shipments, chaotic inventory. The proprietary logistics software she'd insisted on switching to without proper training had backfired spectacularly, costing the firm thousands in penalties. Internal reports showed productivity plunging by nearly 30% as unqualified hires struggled to keep up with basic tasks. I watched from my desk as panic rippled through the company. Senior executives scrambled to contain the fallout, and the CEO convened an emergency board meeting. It was painfully clear Claire's unilateral decisions weren't just unfair. They were toxic to the company's core business. By the end of the week, the board took decisive action. An announcement hit our inboxes. Claire Donovan was terminated effective immediately. The memo cited gross mismanagement and reckless disregard for company policy. In a rare show of accountability, the owner personally added that he would inform industry partners and headhunters of Claire's conduct, effectively ensuring she would find no refuge in competing firms. As I read the notice, a quiet satisfaction settled over me. It wasn't schadenfreude, it was relief. Relief that the woman who had weaponized her authority against honest workers would no longer threaten anyone's livelihood. Relief that Halford and Company could begin healing from the wounds she'd inflicted. Corporate-wide, the momentum shifted. Team leads were empowered to undo Claire's ill-conceived changes. Clients were reassured by direct outreach from senior management, and morale began to rebound. For the first time in months, I felt secure not only in my own position, but in the future of the company I'd fought so hard to save. Even weeks after the court victory, I still woke each morning with a sense of lightness I'd never known. The dread that once pinned me to my sheets had dissolved, replaced by a steady confidence that coursed through me in every cup of coffee, every first step into the office. I carried the settlement check, not just as proof of justice, but as a tangible symbol of my worth. With that money, I enrolled in an advanced supply chain certification program, determined to turn my ordeal into an opportunity for growth. Back at Halford and Company, the aftermath of Claire's mismanagement was undeniable. Shipment logs showed error rates dropping by 40% once her software mandates were repealed. Client satisfaction scores climbed back to record highs. I took quiet satisfaction in watching project teams rebuild their workflows correctly, using training modules I helped develop. My role on the ethics committee became a calling. I worked alongside HR to institute a voice of the employee survey, ensuring no one would ever feel powerless again. Word of Claire's termination and the owner's guarantee that she would be ineligible for future logistics roles circulated industry-wide. I learned that several headhunters had flagged her name in their databases with do not approach, effectively slamming the door on any comeback she might have planned. In a small, bittersweet way, I celebrated that outcome. Her fate was a reminder that abusing authority carries lasting consequences. Every so often, I'd catch former teammates in the hallway, their eyes lighting up when they saw me. They'd share updates on their own careers, crediting the reforms we put in place for their renewed confidence. In those moments, I felt the true scope of what we'd achieved. Not just a legal win, but a cultural transformation. One Friday afternoon, I stood by my window overlooking the courtyard where the new bench now bore a plaque reading "Resilience in Action." I raised my travel mug in a silent toast. To honesty, to respect, and to the power of one person's resolve. My heart soared with a gratitude that went beyond words, knowing that my fight had not only reclaimed my future, but had reshaped an entire company for the better.